Foot binding, also called the 3-inch golden lotus, was one of the most painful beauty standards in history. It usually started when girls were just toddlers, between 4 to 6 years old when their bones were still soft. All their toes except the big one were bent under the sole and wrapped tightly with long, wet cloth strips. The bandages were pulled so tight they slowly snapped the arch of the foot, forcing the toes and heel closer together. Every day the bindings had to be retightened, and this torture could go on for years until the foot shrank down to the so-called 3-inch golden lotus. The custom first appeared as early as the Southern Tang dynasty and eventually became a status symbol across China. The idea was simple. A woman with bound feet couldn't walk far or work in the fields. That made her a living display of her husband's wealth. In fact, tiny feet were seen as the ultimate marriage credential. The result, though, was brutal. Weak bones, constant pain, and lifelong disability. Not every family practiced it, but for those who did, the effects lasted a lifetime. By the early 20th century, as China modernized, the practice finally began to fade and was banned after the fall of the last dynasty. Imperial Castration. Imagine having to give up your body just for a shot at power. That was the life of a eunuch in Imperial China. The practice of castration goes all the way back to the Qin dynasty, over 2,000 years ago. Inside the emperor's palace, filled with concubines and attendants, eunuchs were trusted because they couldn't father children. That meant no secret heirs, no rival bloodlines, and no threat to the emperor's rule. The procedure itself was horrific. Done without anesthesia, a specialist called the castrator removed everything in one cut. The procedure carried a high risk of infection, and many did not survive. Many preserved their severed genitals in a jar so they could be buried whole later. But here's the twist. Despite being mocked and humiliated, eunuchs often held more power than anyone else in the empire. They controlled who got to see the emperor, whispered advice in his ear, and built massive political networks of their own. By the Ming, eunuchs numbered in the tens of thousands and could make or break factions. Earlier, the eunuch Zhao Gao even orchestrated the killing of the Qin second emperor. The most famous of them? Admiral Zheng He, the legendary explorer who commanded giant treasure fleets that sailed across Asia and possibly as far as Africa. Ghost marriages. What happens to a person who dies before they can marry? Traditional belief held that they would become a lonely, wandering spirit, one that might bring misfortune to their family. The solution was ghost marriage, or Minghun, a custom meant to give the dead the status of being married so they wouldn't wander alone in the afterlife. But behind this belief lies a darker truth. Although rare today, in some rural areas, ghost marriage has fueled a shadowy trade in corpses. Families desperate to find a bride for their deceased sons have paid thousands of dollars for the body of a young woman. This demand has fueled grave robberies, with gangs digging up fresh graves to steal female corpses. Some families even pour concrete over tombs or cage the coffins in iron bars, not to keep spirits out, but to keep body snatchers away. And in the most horrifying cases, women have been lured, killed, and sold on the black market to become ghost brides. These rare but real crimes turn a centuries-old superstition into something far more chilling, a reminder of how tradition, desperation, and greed can twist into tragedy. Child brides. In poor families, daughters were sometimes sold as tongyangxi, or child brides. These girls were given away as infants and sent to live in their future husband's household, raised not as cherished wives-to-be but as unpaid labor. To her birth family, it seemed practical, a secure husband for their daughter and one less mouth to feed. In reality, it was often a nightmare. Many of these girls grew up treated more like servants or adopted daughters than future wives. They faced neglect, humiliation, and abuse. And when it came time for marriage, the unions frequently collapsed. Anthropologists call this the Westermark effect. People raised together from childhood usually develop sibling-like feelings, not romantic attraction. The result was higher rates of unhappy marriages, avoidance of intimacy, and desertion. The 1950 marriage law of the People's Republic of China outlawed arranged and child marriages, and tongyangxi began to disappear. Still, in some rural areas, the tradition lingered for decades. Guilt by association. There was no greater punishment in Imperial China than zhu, the extermination of 9 familial generations. It was a ruthless form of collective punishment for high treason. This wasn't just about executing a person, it was about wiping their entire lineage from the face of the earth to ensure no one was left to seek revenge. The 9 generations wasn't about grandparents and great-grandchildren. Instead, it meant 3 entire family branches: your father's relatives, your mother's relatives, and your wife's relatives. The most famous and horrifying example is the case of scholar Fang Xiaoru, who was executed along with all of his kin for defying a new emperor. The punishment was a demonstration of a power so absolute it could extinguish an entire bloodline in a single brutal act. Female infanticide. For centuries in China's history, countless baby girls were drowned, smothered, or abandoned. Why? Because a boy was seen as the breadwinner, the one who would carry on the family name and care for his parents in old age. A girl, on the other hand, meant a costly dowry and would eventually marry into another family. The methods were simple and silent, usually drowning or smothering, and many families saw them as a way to survive. In some places, families even built baby towers, communal sites, where the remains of infants were deposited. Missionaries in the 1600s wrote horrified reports of the practice. By the early 20th century, it had started to fade, but in the 1980s, son preference collided with the one-child policy. Now, instead of drowning, modern technology brought sex-selective abortion and widespread abandonment. The result was one of the most skewed gender ratios in the world. By 2001, 117 boys were born for every 100 girls. The legacy is staggering. Millions of missing women left villages full of unmarried men. With brides in short supply, trafficking and forced marriages surged, creating a black market where women were bought, sold, or even kidnapped. A shadow economy that still haunts China today. Concubinage. In a society where a man's status was measured by his wealth and his ability to produce heirs, concubinage was a widespread and legal tradition. Concubines were officially recognized sexual partners for wealthy men, but they had a much lower status than the man's official wife. They were often bought from poor families or taken as slaves. The life of a concubine, especially within the imperial harem, was a ruthless struggle for the emperor's favor. Some were even buried alive to accompany him in death, a horror briefly revived in the Ming dynasty. But for a rare few, fortune flipped. The most famous? Empress Qixi, who rose from low-ranking concubine to de facto ruler of the Qing dynasty. For every woman like her, thousands lived and died forgotten. Human sacrifice or shunzang was a gruesome practice dating back to the Neolithic Age and peaking during the Shang dynasty. It was rooted in the belief that the dead needed companions and servants in the afterlife. So, family members, concubines, and servants were often buried alive with their master to serve them in the next world. Archaeological digs have uncovered tombs where dozens, even hundreds of people were killed and buried alongside a deceased king or noble. The practice largely fell out of favor after the Zhou dynasty, when people began using terracotta figurines as substitutes for live humans.